Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Dead Space 2 running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now the game is currently running at 1080p with the high preset at the stock 15-watt TDP, and the level of performance that we're getting here is actually pretty decent. Now this isn't the maximum that the game will go to. You can go a little bit higher than that, but I honestly could not tell any visual difference between high and very high, that I just felt like why sacrifice the performance for no visual gain whatsoever. So I was just running at the high setting here, but it can run pretty much almost identically also at the very high setting. It's just it does impact the 1% lows a little bit, and I don't really think it's worth it at all, at least at the stock 15-watt TDP, which again you can see here, and we are getting a well above 60 FPS average, though the 1% lows are dropping below that, but not by a substantial amount. You can tell by the frame times that things are going to be smooth, and visually speaking, I mean, the game still holds up relatively well, though if you look at the details of the textures on both of their faces right now, it's not exactly the most detailed. Same thing with the textures on almost anything, but overall it doesn't really seem to matter much at all once you're actually in the game and playing. So really overall, I think that the game still looks really well, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it has an art style that actually looks really well even all these years later. It was interesting going back and playing through this a bit, just because of the fact that it really just shows that this was really where the game actually started to move, or rather the franchise started to move towards a more action focused narrative, because it really turns down a lot of the horror aspects of it and just turns it into more of a general thriller, though the necromorphs still continue to just be absolutely amazing in terms of just the visual design of them. So overall, this is a franchise that I think has aged very well and honestly holds up, and I kind of get why they're doing a remake of it, because if you look back to a lot of older games, not many really have held up as much as Dead Space has, at least in terms of keeping a consistent aesthetic that really is what most people actually end up coming back to more than anything else. If you see anybody talk about Dead Space on the internet, most of the time they're just going to mention the aesthetic of it, you know, like how amazing the ships looked, how the armor looked, how the enemies looked. It's really the art style of the game itself that I think has aged really well compared to what a lot of people associate with this game. But now if we switch over to the battery saver preset on the APU tuning utility, you can see here at the 8-watt TDP, the game itself is not exactly going to be a fully playable experience, though it's not going to be really as bad as you were kind of expecting it to be. I mean, 8 watts is a very low wattage, and we are still at least keeping a above 30 FPS average, and 1% lows that are not dropping down that low below that FPS. So really overall, we are actually having a pretty decent experience gaming here, though again it's not going to be anywhere near as good as just running this at stock, and the level of performance that we're getting here really falls apart when you realize that this game is over a decade old. So suddenly getting an average that is below 60 in this is a lot less impressive, though again we are using very little power here, so this is really more of an academic test more than anything else. I don't really expect you to reasonably run the game like this to play unless you're on a system that is just so power limited, or just like so temperature limited, that you're really realistically only stuck playing like this, in which case you really took a massive L on that one. I mean, I have at this point only encountered one system that has had cooling so bad that even running a chip at 10 watts was overwhelming. So it's a rare situation for the most part, and I don't think most of you are really going to find yourself in that situation. So let's switch over to some of the TDPs that people are realistically going to be using. Now the 25-watt TDP really makes a huge difference compared to both stock and definitely over the 8-watt TDP, because here we're now getting averages that are well and clear above 60 FPS, where we're almost at an average of 100 FPS, and 1% lows that are more than comfortably above 60 FPS, which means we're going to have an extremely smooth experience here. And if you have a high refresh rate monitor, you can actually utilize that in this game. So it's not exactly a game that is based off high precision gaming, so not something that's necessarily going to be needed, but it is welcome. And I think it's safe to say that this is really how most of you guys should play this if you actually have the opportunity to play the game on here. But let's look at what the high performance preset is actually going to end up doing here. So the performance preset is interesting because it does give us still the nice boosts in the 1% lows, though they're a little bit lower than they were in the other area. It really doesn't matter too much because we're in a different spot, and they're close enough with averages that are also very very similar. So we're not seeing a huge uplift here. I think part of it has to do with the fact that the GPU is pretty much already running at max clock speeds, so it's not really going to be doing much there, and the CPU itself is not going to be utilized more than it already is, because this is an era where even having a quad-core CPU was kind of overkill. You know, for the longest time, the i5 was really just the way to go, just because, you know, you get the 4 cores, no hyper-threading. Hyper-threading wasn't really necessary at the time, and really for multiple generations, you were kind of just better off getting the i5 than buying an i7. It's because this is an era of games that were extremely single-threaded. You can tell by the fact that we only have essentially 10 to 15% utilization of the CPU, that we're pretty much just hitting a singular core. So really raising the TDP isn't going to feed much more power into that CPU, because it's already pretty much running as fast as it's going to at one core, and the GPU is almost always going to be maxed out in terms of speed, and if it's not, it's usually because it's just waiting on the CPU to do things. So really there's not going to be any noticeable gain between this and the balanced preset, except you are raising the heat being generated a little bit. So I would really just refrain from playing at anything other than the balanced preset. Really, stock and balance seem to be the best ways to go. Obviously you're not going battery saver unless you're just in the worst possible circumstance, and the performance preset is really just going to be unnecessary in a game like this that already runs really well at the stock TDP and the balanced TDP. So the high performance really is not going to be necessary at all, unless you just also need to heat up your room and maybe even just cook your wrists. And just for posterity, here is the game running at the max graphics while also still using the performance TDP, just so that you can see that 1, no real visual difference, 2, no real performance difference. It's kind of just there to really just, I don't even know like what exactly it's doing, but the high performance is really just not worth it over just going with high and maybe just squeezing out whatever extra FPS you would from that, because really visually there is no difference whatsoever. And even in terms of the performance that you get is really just going to be all over the place. So overall, the experience of playing this game on almost all of the presets was enjoyable, except for the battery saver one, though again, sheer desperation, the battery saver mode is at least playable, but everything else is going to give you an above 60 FPS experience. So really this game is another one that is just an absolute win on this chip. You're going to be able to play it realistically on almost any settings that you would want, in terms of whether you want to just keep things at stock, if you want to raise the TDP a bit, it's still going to be playable. And again, if you are in those desperate situations where that 8-watt mode is necessary, well, I feel bad for you, because that is a rough spot to be in, and especially because these Zen 2 based APUs really don't seem to scale down to those lower wattages as well as Zen 3 does. But again, if you're in that situation, I can totally understand that you can't just immediately replace your system or anything like that. So at least the game is playable at that 8-watt TDP, which is still impressive in the sense that it is only 8 watts, though after seeing the 5600U handle games at that 8 watts, it's hard to be impressed by the 5500U. That really seems to be where the gains are at, and it just goes to show how efficient Zen 3 is compared to Zen 2. But anyways, I'm still blown away that we're over 1,000 subscribers, guys. It's kind of just an insane milestone, and I'm almost unable to wrap my head around it, just because it's like I feel like it hasn't even been that long, you know what I mean? It's just one of those things where I've done other YouTube channels before, they've all ended up just dying on me because, you know, I either don't keep up with them or it was never anything that anyone really realistically wanted to see. So I mean, just seeing success here is kind of just mind-blowing, and I'm a little speechless. So again, I really just want to thank you guys so much for the support. You guys are amazing, and I'm blown away. So thank you so much, and I will catch you in the next one.